When did you blackmail your school's principal? I was walking past Mrs. Sullivan's classroom when I heard moaning. Her door was slightly open, so I peeked in and nearly tripped. Mrs. Sullivan was kissing Mr. Ayers from history class on top of Principal Bowman's chest. Mrs. Sullivan spotted me immediately, so I turned and ran down the hallway as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard her heels clicking on the tile floor as she chased after me, screaming for me to wait. I was almost to the exit when Principal Bowman appeared from a side hallway and blocked my path. He was breathing hard and his tie was crooked. "Back inside the classroom, young man. We need to talk." He walked me back to Mrs. Sullivan's room where she and Mr. Ayers were trying to put their clothes back on. "I don't want any part in whatever freak show you guys have," I said. Principal Bowman locked the classroom door behind us and turned to face me. "What do you want from us?" Principal Bowman asked. I stared at him, confused. Was he trying to bribe me? He explained that all three of them were married and had reputations to protect. He said I clearly wasn't going to keep quiet for free, so what was my price? "I don't want your money." Mrs. Sullivan actually laughed and said thank God because teachers don't have any. "But there is something I want." All three of them leaned forward, waiting to hear my demands. I took a deep breath and laid out exactly what I wanted. Every single student currently failing their classes would get a passing grade. No exceptions. These teachers made their classes unnecessarily difficult when kids were already dealing with enough problems at home. I also wanted every school lunch debt forgiven immediately. Principal Bowman's face turned red, and he stood up from the desk. He started pacing around the room, waving his hands while ranting about budgets and board meetings. He kept saying the lunch debt alone was thousands of dollars. How did I expect him to make that disappear without anyone asking questions? The whole system would notice if suddenly every kid's account was zeroed out. I don't know. Figure it out. You have until the end of the week before I contact your spouses. I walked out of that classroom feeling like I could fly. For once in my life, I had power over the people who made school miserable for so many kids. My best friend Noah was waiting by my locker, and I told him everything was going to change by morning. But the next morning, I woke up to loud knocking on my bedroom door. My mom was standing there looking terrified with a police officer behind her. I sat up in bed trying to figure out what was happening. I grabbed my phone to check the time and saw a text from Noah. "I told them what you did. You're a monster." The officer stepped into my room and asked me to get dressed. His face was grim, like he was dealing with something serious. My mom was crying now, asking what was going on. The officer ignored her and kept his eyes on me. He waited while I threw on jeans and a hoodie. The officer told my mom to stay home and that they'd call her soon. The officer opened the back door, and I slid onto the hard plastic seat. He got in the front and started driving toward the station. We sat in silence for a few minutes before he finally spoke. "You're under arrest for the sewer slide of Principal Bowman." My brain couldn't process what he just said, and I kept repeating the word in my head, trying to make sense of it. The car turned into the police station parking lot, and I saw at least 3 news vans already parked outside with reporters setting up cameras on the sidewalk. A bunch of kids from the school were standing behind them, holding up their phones, recording everything. The officer pulled around to a side entrance and told me to keep my head down when we got out, but not to cover my face because that would look guilty. He opened my door and grabbed my arm to help me out, and I tried to duck my head but caught sight of kids from my chemistry class filming and pointing at me. The side door slammed shut behind us, and we were in a long hallway with green walls and that smell like old coffee and cleaning supplies. He took me to a desk where another officer was sitting looking bored and eating a sandwich. The officer took my backpack and dumped everything out on the counter, going through my stuff like I was some kind of criminal. They made me stand against a white wall with height marks while a camera flashed in my face 3 times. The fingerprinting station was next, where they pressed each of my fingers onto this digital scanner that kept beeping when I didn't press hard enough. The intake officer read me my rights in this flat voice like he'd done it 1,000 times before, while typing on his computer without even looking at me. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely sign the paper he shoved at me. Principal Bowman was dead, and somehow they thought I had something to do with it. Walking down another hallway toward what they called the holding area, I noticed this older guy in a gray suit watching me from an office doorway. He had this look on his face like he was trying to figure out what kind of person I was and whether I was capable of whatever they thought I did. Later I found out that was Detective Glenn Black, but right then he was just another adult staring at me like I was guilty. They put me in this small room with a metal table and 2 chairs and told me to wait. 2 officers came in after maybe 20 minutes, acting all friendly and casual, like we were just having a normal conversation. One of them pushed a soda across the table and said things would go easier if I just explained my side of what happened with Principal Bowman. The fake nice tone reminded me of every cop show I'd ever watched where they pretend to be your friend right before they arrest you. "I want a lawyer." The officers looked at each other, and the friendly one's face changed completely, like I'd just made everything worse for myself. They left me alone again, and I sat there staring at the scratches on the metal table, wondering how many other kids had sat in this exact chair. About an hour later, this woman walked in wearing a black suit and carrying a briefcase that looked too heavy for her small frame. "I'm Melanie Reyes, your public defender, and from now on you don't say anything to anyone without me present." She turned to the officers who had followed her in and told them the interview was over and any further questions would go through her. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 20s, but she had this energy that made the officers back off immediately. Once we were alone in a different room with better chairs, she opened her briefcase and pulled out a yellow legal pad. She explained that they were considering charging me with extortion or coercion that contributed to someone's death, which could be a felony. Since I was 17, the prosecutor was deciding whether to try me as a juvenile or an adult, which would make a huge difference in what could happen to me. The word death kept echoing in my head because this was real, and Principal Bowman was never coming back, and somehow I was blamed for it. She asked me to tell her exactly what happened, and I started from the beginning with walking past the classroom and seeing them together. She wrote down everything without judging, but kept asking for specific details about times and exact words that were said. After what felt like forever, they moved me to a holding room by myself, with just a bench and a toilet behind a half wall. They'd taken my phone and my watch, so I had no idea what time it was or what people were saying about me online. All I could think about was Noah looking me in the eye yesterday, when I told him what happened and how he promised he wouldn't tell anyone. The betrayal hurt worse than being arrested because he was supposed to be my best friend, and he sold me out. Hours passed with nothing but the sound of doors slamming somewhere down the hall and voices I couldn't make out. Finally, an officer came and said they were taking me to court for something called an arraignment. Walking through the courthouse hallway with my hands cuffed in front of me, I saw my mom standing by the elevator trying to get to me. Tears were running down her face and she kept reaching out like she could somehow pull me away from all this. Melanie appeared and quickly told her not to say anything about the case, but that she'd be there for me and everything would be okay. Mom nodded but kept crying, and I wanted to tell her I was sorry for putting her through this, but the officer was already pushing me forward. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood panels and flags, and a judge who looked tired and annoyed. The prosecutor read out the charges saying I had engaged in criminal coercion that resulted in the death of a school official. The judge reviewed the charges and started listing conditions for my release, including no contact with any school staff involved and no posting about the case on social media. He set bail at $5,000 and released me to my mom's custody with strict orders to appear for all future court dates. Mom had to sign a bunch of papers while I stood there feeling relief mixed with dread about what would happen when everyone at the school found out. The ride home was silent, except for the radio playing some old song Mom usually sang along to, but not today. That evening I was lying on my bed when my phone buzzed with a news alert from the local station. The headline said Principal Bowman had died, and the school district had released a brief statement about the tragic loss of a dedicated educator. Reading those words made me feel sick, because his family was planning a funeral, and his kids would grow up without a dad, and somehow this all started with me walking past that classroom door. Mom had already started making dinner by the time I got to the kitchen, moving pans around without looking at me. The smell of pasta sauce filled the room, but my stomach felt too tight to eat anything. She set 2 plates on the table, and we sat down across from each other, the only sound coming from our forks scraping against the ceramic. I pushed the food around my plate while she stared at her glass of water. After about 10 minutes of this painful silence, she finally looked up and her voice came out shaky. "Is what they're saying true?" I kept my eyes on my plate and mumbled that it was complicated. Her hand slammed down on the table so hard the glasses jumped, and she stood up and walked to the sink with her back to me. Neither of us touched our food after that. Around 9 that night, my phone rang and Melanie's name showed up on the screen. She told me not to contact Noah or anyone from the school, not even to defend myself, and said she'd already filed requests for all the evidence the police had collected. The way she said it made it clear this wasn't a suggestion, but an order. She reminded me that anything I said or wrote could be used against me, then hung up before I could ask any questions. Not being able to explain myself or tell my side made me want to throw my phone at the wall. I woke up the next morning to my mom showing me her phone with the school district's website pulled up. The announcement said several staff members were on administrative leave pending an investigation into an incident involving inappropriate conduct. Reading those words made my chest tighten, because now everyone would know about the affair, and Mrs. Sullivan and Mr. Ayers were watching their careers fall apart. My own phone started buzzing nonstop with Instagram messages and texts from numbers I didn't recognize. Each message called me a killer, or said I destroyed a good man who cared about students. One person sent a photo of Principal Bowman at graduation last year, with the caption that I took away those kids' chance to have him at theirs. The notifications kept coming faster than I could delete them, each one making me feel sick but also angry because they didn't know what really happened in that classroom. Melanie called again that afternoon, sounding more serious than before. She said the prosecution had a screenshot of my text to Noah about contacting the spouses by Friday, plus written statements from all 3 teachers about my demands. She needed me to tell her exactly what happened, word for word, because my own messages were becoming their strongest evidence. I took a deep breath and started from the beginning, explaining how I walked past the classroom, what I saw, how they chased me, everything Principal Bowman said about protecting their reputations. I told her about my demands for passing grades and lunch debt, making it clear I never wanted anyone to get hurt or die. She stayed quiet while I talked, only interrupting to ask about specific times or exact phrases that were used. When I finished, she said she'd call me back after reviewing everything. 2 days later, Melanie came to our house with a folder of papers. She pulled out printed screenshots of messages Noah had sent to the school counselor the night before my arrest. The messages said I was playing God with people's lives and he was scared of what I might do next. Reading his actual words hurt worse than the arrest because he made me sound dangerous and unstable. But underneath the anger in his messages, I could see real fear, like he actually thought I might hurt someone. Melanie flipped to another page showing the preliminary police report. Principal Bowman had died at his home around 11 that night, with a blood alcohol level 3 times the legal limit. No signs of foul play, no other substances, just alcohol poisoning after drinking alone in his home office. Knowing he drank himself to that point after our confrontation made my stomach turn because even though I didn't kill him directly, my threat pushed him there. Later that week, Mom came into my room at midnight and sat on the edge of my bed. She started telling me about when I was 8 and Dad had just left, how she couldn't afford the lunch fees and got letters from the school threatening to send us to collections. She worked double shifts at the hospital for 2 months just to clear that debt, coming home so tired she could barely stay awake to help me with homework. Her story helped me understand why seeing kids go hungry at lunch made me so angry, but it didn't make what I did to Principal Bowman okay. She squeezed my hand and left without saying anything else. The next morning I opened Instagram to find a DM from Taylor Watson, who ran the underground school news blog that everyone read. She said she wanted to hear my side of the story and promised to keep it anonymous if I wanted. The message sat there while I stared at it, knowing Melanie had specifically told me not to talk to anyone about the case. But the need to have someone, anyone, understand what really happened was so strong I had to close the app before I did something stupid. I turned off my phone and shoved it in my drawer, trying to focus on anything except how badly I wanted to type out everything and hit send. 3 days passed before Sherman Hartley from the district office sent out an email to all parents about the whole mess. Mom showed it to me on her laptop, and the way he wrote made me want to punch something. He kept calling Principal Bowman's death an unfortunate incident, and said they were conducting an ongoing review of the situation, while providing counseling resources for students who needed support. The whole thing read like some robot wrote it, full of big words that meant nothing, and promises about transparency that everyone knew were lies. He never mentioned the affair or the real reasons behind everything, just kept repeating how the district was committed to maintaining educational excellence during this difficult time. Mom scrolled through parent comments underneath, and most of them were asking what actually happened since the email explained nothing. That same afternoon, videos from a candlelight vigil at the school started showing up everywhere online. Someone filmed the whole thing and posted it on YouTube, where it got thousands of views in just a few hours. Teachers stood at the microphone crying while they talked about Principal Bowman being such a dedicated educator who always put students first. Mrs. Henderson from the math department sobbed through a story about how he stayed late to help struggling kids with their homework. Mr. Torres said Principal Bowman fought for every penny of funding to improve our school. Watching these people act like he was some kind of saint when I knew what he was really doing in that classroom made me feel sick and angry at the same time. Kids from the school kept sharing the video with crying emoji and comments about how much they'd miss him. The next morning, the teachers' union put out their own statement that Mom found on the news website. They went on and on about protecting the privacy rights of educators and demanding due process in any investigations related to recent events. The way they worded everything made it clear they were protecting Mrs. Sullivan and Mr. Ayers without actually saying their names. The statement said accusations against staff members shouldn't be made public until proper investigations were complete, and reminded everyone that teachers deserved the same legal protections as any other citizen. They ended by saying the union would provide full legal support to any members facing unfair treatment or harassment. Reading between the lines, they were basically telling everyone to back off and stop asking questions about what really happened. Screenshots from student group chats started spreading around Instagram and Snapchat by lunchtime. Kids were actually debating whether the lunch debt thing was a real problem, or if I was just making stuff up to justify what I did. Some people posted pictures of the negative balance warnings they got at the cafeteria register every day. Others shared stories about teachers who gave impossible tests or refused to round up grades even when kids were just 1 point away from passing. Cody from my chemistry class wrote this long post about how Mr. Peterson failed half the class last semester even though everyone studied for hours. At least people were finally talking about the real problems instead of just calling me a killer. Melanie called that evening and asked me to come to her office the next day to discuss something important about my case. When I got there, she pulled out a folder and spread papers across her desk. She explained that, legally speaking, the prosecution cared way more about my written ultimatum than anything I said verbally in that hallway. She pointed to the screenshot of my text to Noah about contacting spouses by Friday, and said putting threats in writing was the biggest mistake I made. The prosecution would use that message as their main evidence, since it proved premeditation and showed I planned to follow through with destroying their lives. She said if I just kept everything verbal, they'd have a much harder time proving intent. Realizing how stupid I was to text Noah about any of it made me want to go back in time and delete everything. 2 mornings later, I was sitting by my bedroom window when I spotted Mrs. Sullivan walking into the district office building across the street from our apartment complex. She had someone with her who looked like a lawyer based on the fancy suit and briefcase. Our eyes met for just a second before she quickly looked away and hurried inside. That brief moment of eye contact told me everything about how she felt. She blamed me for destroying her life, for Principal Bowman's death, for her career falling apart. The hatred in her eyes made me realize she'd probably testify against me if the case went to trial. Word started getting around school that Detective Glenn Black had been interviewing students all week about what they knew. Kids in my biology class said he was actually pretty cool and didn't try to pressure anyone into saying stuff they didn't know. Sarah mentioned he asked real questions about the lunch debt problem and seemed interested in understanding why students were angry about school policies. Tom said the detective took notes about everything, even stuff that didn't seem related to my case, like complaints about unfair grading. At least one person seemed interested in the whole picture, instead of just trying to nail me for Principal Bowman's death. Melanie discovered something huge when she got the discovery documents from the prosecution. The security cameras in that specific hallway were down for scheduled maintenance the exact day I walked past Mrs. Sullivan's classroom. She showed me the maintenance log that proved the cameras were offline from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. Without that footage, it became my word against theirs about what exactly I saw and how the confrontation went down. Mrs. Sullivan and Mr. Ayers could claim I misunderstood what I saw or that I was lying about the whole thing. The prosecution would have to rely on their testimony and my threatening messages instead of actual video proof. A week later, the judge issued a protective order that Melanie had to explain to me in detail. I had to stay at least 500 feet away from Mrs. Sullivan and Mr. Ayers at all times, which meant I couldn't go to certain stores, restaurants, or even some streets in town without potentially violating it. The order included their homes, workplaces, and anywhere they might regularly go. Melanie gave me a map with red circles showing all the places I had to avoid. Looking at how much of town was now off limits made me feel like a prisoner, even though I wasn't in jail. She said violating the order even accidentally would land me in juvenile detention immediately. That night, someone leaked the screenshot of my ultimatum text to a student Discord server, and within hours, literally everyone at the school had seen it. The message spread to Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, everywhere, but completely out of context without any explanation of what led up to it. People started making memes about it and posting jokes about me thinking I was some kind of superhero fighting for student rights. Others called me a psycho who drove a good man to kill himself over petty school complaints. Having my words twisted and shared without the full story made me want to scream at everyone to shut up and listen to what really happened. The next day, I walked into the cafeteria trying to avoid everyone, but Noah was already there by the lunch line. I tried to turn around, but he grabbed my arm and pulled me closer. He leaned in and whispered that Mr. Ayers had come to his house crying about how I was going to destroy multiple families with kids. His eyes were all red and puffy like he hadn't slept in days. The way his hands were shaking made me realize someone had really messed with his head about this whole thing. I pulled my arm away and walked out without getting any food. 2 days later, the school secretary called me out of math class and handed me a yellow slip for a disciplinary hearing. The assistant principal's office was freezing, and she wouldn't even look up from her papers while reading this long script about my behavior in the hallway that day. She kept talking about disruption of the educational environment and inappropriate conduct like I was just some regular troublemaker. My mom had to leave work early to sit through this stupid meeting where they gave me 3 days of in-school suspension. The whole thing felt like checking boxes while my actual life was falling apart around me. A week after that, Melanie called to say the court was ordering mandatory counseling as part of my release conditions. The counselor's name was Hala Serrano, and she worked with kids in the juvenile system. I showed up at her office building downtown and sat in the waiting room next to other kids who looked just as miserable as me. When she finally called me in, I crossed my arms and slumped in the chair across from her desk. She had all these certificates on the wall and a bookshelf full of psychology books that made the whole place feel fake and clinical. We spent the first session with her asking basic questions while I gave one-word answers and stared at the clock behind her head. 3 sessions later, something shifted when she asked me what I actually wanted to happen that day in the classroom. I started talking about the lunch debt and the failing grades and how nobody ever listened to kids about real problems. She didn't interrupt or take notes, just nodded and let me keep going. I finally said out loud that I wanted to force them to help students, not hurt anyone, but I was starting to understand that what I meant didn't erase what actually happened. She asked me how I was processing the difference between my intentions and the impact of my actions. That question stuck in my head for days afterward. Meanwhile, Melanie was digging through every piece of evidence she could get her hands on. She called me excited one afternoon because she'd gotten the phone records from that night. Principal Bowman hadn't called me at all, just his wife and someone at the district office around 9:30. She said this helped prove I didn't harass him after the initial threat, but it also showed he was probably trying to figure out how to handle my demands. The timestamp on his call to the district was less than an hour before he died. I was walking out of school the next week when Taylor Watson appeared from behind a car in the parking lot. She promised everything would be completely off the record if I just gave her some context about what really happened. Her recorder was already in her hand, and she kept saying how people deserve to hear my side of things. Part of me wanted so badly to explain everything, to have someone understand why I did what I did. But Melanie's voice was in my head warning me about talking to anyone, especially reporters. I shook my head and kept walking to my mom's car, while Taylor followed me asking more questions. She finally gave up when I got in and locked the door. Later that week, Melanie discovered something interesting in the public records. The school board had scheduled a closed session about budget irregularities for the same week Principal Bowman died. The agenda mentioned reviewing discretionary spending and student account management procedures. Melanie wondered out loud if he was already under pressure about the lunch debt situation before I ever said anything. Maybe my threat was just the final straw on top of other problems he was dealing with. During my next session with Hala, she had me write a letter taking responsibility for the harm my coercion caused. She said I'd never actually send it, but writing it would help me process everything. I sat there for 20 minutes staring at the blank paper before finally writing the words. Putting down, "I'm sorry for my role in your death," made my hand shake and my stomach hurt. Everything felt more real and horrible than any legal charge or court date ever could. She had me read it out loud and I barely got through it without crying. 2 days later, Melanie called with more evidence from her investigation. The badge swipe records from the school showed something weird. Both Mrs. Sullivan and Mr. Ayers had accessed the building the night Principal Bowman died, hours after school closed. Sullivan swiped in at 8:45 and Ayers at 9:15. They both left around 10:30 according to the exit logs. Melanie said it was strange, but warned me not to jump to any conclusions about what they were doing there. Maybe they were trying to figure out their own response to my threat, or maybe it was something else entirely. The next morning, Detective Glenn Black asked to meet with Melanie at her office, and she let me sit in on the conversation. He told her off the record that they were investigating multiple factors that contributed to what happened that night. The way he said it suggested I might not be the only one responsible for Principal Bowman's death. That thought brought this weird mix of relief and guilt, because feeling relieved seemed wrong when someone was still dead. Taylor showed up at my house 2 days later with a folder full of papers, and this look on her face like she'd found something big. She pushed past me into the living room and spread the documents across the coffee table while Mom was at work. An anonymous source had sent her a screenshot of Principal Bowman's calendar from the week after he died, and right there on Thursday was a meeting labeled Lunch Debt Policy Review with the School Board Finance Committee. My stomach dropped seeing it because he was actually going to do something about the lunch debt anyway. Taylor kept pointing at different parts of the calendar showing how he'd blocked out 3 hours for the meeting and had notes about sustainable solutions typed into the appointment details. The whole thing made my threat feel even more pointless, since changes might have happened without me forcing anything. That night I couldn't sleep, and around 2 in the morning my phone buzzed with a voice message from Noah. His voice was all broken up and shaky as he talked about how Mr. Ayers had cornered him that morning after I got arrested. Noah said the teacher told him I was dangerous and would destroy innocent families with kids if nobody stopped me. He kept saying sorry over and over in the message, but also said he still thought he did the right thing to protect people. I listened to it 3 times trying to figure out if I should hate him or feel bad for him getting manipulated by a teacher who was just trying to save himself. The next morning, Melanie called with the official autopsy report that she'd finally gotten from the prosecutor's office. She read through the medical terms, but basically Principal Bowman had drunk almost a whole bottle of whiskey that night, and his blood alcohol was .32. There were no signs anyone else was there, and no evidence of any struggle or force. The report listed it as self-inflicted after acute alcohol poisoning, which meant he drank himself to death on purpose. Knowing all the medical details didn't make me feel better or worse, just different about that whole night. Later that week, Sherman Hartley stood behind a podium at the district office with reporters crowded around asking questions. He kept talking about mental health resources and crisis prevention programs while completely avoiding any questions about lunch debt or grading policies. Every time a reporter tried to ask about the actual issues at the school, he'd redirect to talking about counseling services and wellness initiatives. His whole speech was just empty words meant to make it look like they were doing something without actually changing anything. During my next session with Hala, she had me work through this exercise where I wrote down what I wanted to happen on one side of a paper and what actually happened on the other. She helped me see that my concerns about the lunch debt and failing grades were real problems that needed fixing. But she also made me understand that threatening people to get what I wanted was wrong, no matter how good my reasons were. For the first time, I could hold both ideas in my head without one canceling out the other. Meanwhile, students at the school had started their own investigation into what happened that night. Someone created a shared document tracking every time Mr. Ayers' story changed when he talked to different people. They compared his badge swipes showing he was at the school until 10:30 that night, with his statement saying he went home at 5. Taylor texted me that she was filing public records requests to get the actual security footage and entry logs from that whole week. She said if there were lies being told, she was going to find them legally through proper channels. Melanie saw the text over my shoulder during our meeting and immediately told me to stay out of it completely. She said Taylor could investigate all she wanted as a journalist, but if I got involved, it would look like witness tampering or obstruction. It felt weird letting someone else fight a battle I'd started, but Melanie said that was exactly what needed to happen now. The school board scheduled another closed session that started at 7 p.m. and didn't end until after midnight, according to the reporters waiting outside. People walking past the conference room said they could hear raised voices and what sounded like arguing coming through the walls. Whatever they were discussing was clearly bigger than just my threat, or even Principal Bowman's death. Something else was going on that had the whole board fighting past midnight on a Tuesday. The next day, Noah found me sitting alone in the back corner of the library during lunch. He sat down across from me and started talking really fast about how Mrs. Sullivan had warned him I'd end up in jail, or worse if he didn't report me immediately. She'd told him they had evidence I was planning to hurt people and that I was dangerous. The manipulation was so obvious now, but the damage was already done between us. We sat there in silence for a while before he got up and walked away without saying anything else. Later that afternoon, Taylor sent me copies of documents she'd gotten through her records request, showing 3 years of parent complaints about the exact issues I'd tried to force them to fix. Parents had been writing letters about unfair grading policies that punished kids for things beyond their control. They'd been begging for help with lunch debts that kept growing even when families were struggling. Seeing actual proof that these were real problems that people had been complaining about for years didn't make what I did okay, but it did prove I wasn't making up the unfairness. Melanie showed up at our kitchen table the next morning with a yellow legal pad and told me we needed to write my statement for court. She made me go through everything 3 times, crossing out parts where I tried to justify what I did and circling places where I took responsibility. We spent 4 hours writing and rewriting until I had 2 pages that admitted I threatened them without making excuses about why. My hand was cramping from all the drafts, but Melanie kept saying the judge needed to see I understood what I did wrong. She had me practice reading it out loud over and over until the words stopped feeling fake. 2 days later, Detective Glenn Black called Melanie's office while I was there, and she put him on speaker. He said the prosecutor was willing to drop the felony charges down to misdemeanor harassment if I took the deal right now. My whole body went weak with relief, even though I knew having any criminal record would mess up college applications and job stuff forever. Melanie told him we'd take it, and started writing down all the terms he was listing. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday at 9 in the morning. I threw up twice that morning before Mom drove me to the courthouse. The judge was this older woman with gray hair who looked at me over her glasses while the prosecutor explained everything. She said Principal Bowman had been dealing with budget problems and personal issues, but that didn't excuse my threats. Her voice was calm, but every word hit hard because I knew she was right about the line I crossed. The prosecutor read out the agreement they'd made with Melanie. 18 months of juvenile diversion with probation check-ins every 2 weeks. 200 hours of community service that had to be done at the school. Mandatory counseling sessions twice a week for 6 months, then once a week after that. Permanent no-contact orders with Mrs. Sullivan and Mr. Ayers that would last even after I turned 18. The judge asked if I understood, and I said yes, even though the restrictions felt like chains wrapping around my whole life. She signed the papers and told me this was my chance to make better choices. That evening, Mom was watching the news when Sherman Hartley came on talking about an independent review of grading policies and lunch debt procedures. He stood at a podium saying the district was committed to examining these issues, while the teachers involved remained on administrative leave pending investigation. It was exactly what I'd wanted to happen, but seeing it come from all this destruction made me feel empty instead of satisfied. The next morning, Taylor's article went live on the school news site. She'd researched lunch debt statistics for 3 counties and interviewed parents about academic pressure without mentioning any names from our situation. Reading her balanced take on the real problems helped me see past my own mess to the bigger issues that still needed fixing. During my next session with Hala, she had me practice what I'd say to Mom about putting her through this nightmare. We role-played it 5 times with Hala pretending to be Mom until I could say the words without getting defensive or making excuses. The apology came easier once I stopped trying to explain why I did it and just focused on being sorry for the pain I caused. That weekend, Mom pulled out a shoebox full of old bills and receipts from when Dad left 3 years ago. She showed me the past due notices and the lunch account statements with growing balances. She told me about skipping her own meals so I could eat and choosing between putting gas in the car or paying the lunch debt. Her voice cracked when she explained calling the school to beg for more time to pay. I finally understood why seeing other kids go through that same struggle made me so angry. She held my hand and said she got why I reacted so strongly, but wished I'd talked to her instead of trying to fix it myself. 3 days later, the PTA president sent out an email about a fundraiser to help families with lunch debt while they waited for policy changes. They were doing a car wash and bake sale that Saturday, with all money going to pay off accounts. It was a small fix that wouldn't solve the real problem, but seeing regular people step up to help gave me a tiny spark of hope. By Thursday, the rumors were everywhere that Mrs. Sullivan had turned in her resignation letter and Mr. Ayers got transferred to a district 40 miles away. Kids were posting about seeing moving trucks at their houses and how substitute teachers were taking over their classes permanently. There was no satisfaction in watching their careers fall apart, just this hollow feeling that everyone involved had lost something that couldn't be fixed. Mom heard from another parent that both their spouses had filed for divorce once everything came out. The whole thing had destroyed 3 marriages on top of everything else. I kept thinking about their kids having to deal with their parents' mistakes becoming public like that. My community service started the next Monday, with me showing up at 6 in the morning to help the custodial staff clean classrooms before school started. The janitor handed me a mop and bucket without saying anything, just pointing at the hallway where I needed to start. Kids I used to eat lunch with walked past me like I was invisible while I cleaned their shoe prints off the tile floors. The wet mop made this gross sloshing sound every time I pushed it across the floor, and my back was already killing me from bending over for 2 hours straight. Sherman Hartley's voice came over the intercom around 7:30, talking about some new lunch account procedures they were putting in place. He used all these big words about hardship waivers and proactive measures, but never once mentioned what happened with Principal Bowman or why they suddenly cared about kids who couldn't pay. The janitor snorted and muttered something about how it only took someone dying for them to notice poor kids existed. I kept mopping while Sherman droned on about application forms being available in the main office starting Monday. When the bell rang for first period, I had to wheel my bucket against the wall and watch everyone rush to class without me. Some kid from my English class stepped right through the wet floor I'd just cleaned and tracked mud everywhere without even looking at me. I spent another hour redoing that whole section while classes went on behind closed doors. During second period, I got permission to grab my books from my locker since I had homework to turn in later. When I opened the metal door, a folded piece of paper fell out onto the floor. Noah's handwriting was all messy, like he wrote it fast without thinking too hard about the words. He said he wasn't ready to talk yet, but he was sorry for making everything worse than it already was. He wrote that Mr. Ayers had convinced him I was dangerous, and that families would be destroyed if he didn't report me. The paper was wrinkled like he'd crumpled it up and smoothed it out a bunch of times before finally shoving it through the vents. I stuffed it in my pocket and went back to cleaning the science wing bathrooms, which smelled like someone had been smoking in the stalls. By lunch, I was exhausted, and my clothes were gross from cleaning chemicals and dirty water. The cafeteria lady let me eat in the kitchen since I wasn't allowed to sit with regular students during my service hours. She gave me extra chicken nuggets without saying anything about payment, which was probably against the rules, but she did it anyway. After lunch, I had to report to Hala's office for my weekly check-in. She had this folder on her desk with all these forms and reports about my progress. She signed one of the papers and showed me where she'd written that I was showing real insight and taking responsibility instead of just going through the motions. Her pen made these quick scratching sounds as she filled out more boxes about attendance and participation. She said the court would see these reports, and it mattered that I was actually trying to understand what I'd done wrong instead of just counting down days. When I got home that afternoon, there was a message on my phone from Taylor. She kept it short, just saying if I ever wanted to talk about changing policies the right way, she'd listen. She said she knew I'd messed up, but the issues I cared about were still real, and maybe we could work on them through proper channels once everything settled down. Reading her message made my chest feel less tight for the first time in weeks. Mom had left money on the counter for groceries with a note saying she'd be home late from her second job. I walked to the store and bought the stuff on her list, plus grabbed a job application from customer service. The manager said they were hiring stock people for overnight shifts, which would work around my school schedule. I filled it out right there and turned it in before I could change my mind. 2 weeks later, I got the job and started working 4 nights a week unloading trucks and stocking shelves. The work sucked, but the pay was decent, and I needed money for court fees and to help Mom with bills. After my third paycheck, I had enough saved to do something I'd been thinking about. This kid Cody in my math class kept getting his lunch tray taken away because his account was empty. I went to the office before school and put $60 on his account without giving my name. The secretary looked at me funny but processed it anyway. Cody never knew it was me, but watching him eat a full lunch without that embarrassed look made the overnight shifts worth it. 3 days later, I had to clean the admin hallway as part of my service. Principal Bowman's old office door was open, and maintenance guys were carrying out boxes of his stuff. His desk was already gone, and they were pulling his diplomas off the walls. The room looked smaller without all his furniture and awards. Those same lights that used to make me nervous when I got called to his office just looked like regular ceiling lights now. The maintenance guy asked me to mop the floor once they cleared everything out. I pushed the bucket into the empty room and started working on the corners where dust had collected behind the furniture. There was a water stain on the carpet where his coffee maker used to sit. A pushpin was still stuck in the wall where some poster used to hang. None of it felt important anymore. Just an empty room that needed cleaning. Standing there with my mop, I understood something important. The anger that made me threaten him was gone, but the problems that made me angry were still there. Kids were still hungry, and teachers still made classes too hard, and the system still sucked. But destroying people's lives wasn't how to fix any of it. There had to be better ways to fight that didn't leave everyone broken. I could work with people like Taylor who wanted change too. I could earn money to help kids directly. I could wait until I was older and had real power to make real changes. The path would be longer and harder, but at least nobody else would have to die. I really appreciate you hanging in there with me today. All the questioning, all the wondering, it's been so meaningful to explore these moments with you. Until we meet again, if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.